A mother's unexpected discovery at a secluded hotel unravels a high-stakes secret between Jungkook and Jimin, changing their lives and the industry forever. The metallic click of the keycard felt like a gunshot in the silent, carpeted hallway of the Lotte Hotel. But the sight waiting for Mrs. Jian inside Suite 701 was far more explosive than any sound she had ever heard. The room was bathed in the flickering, cold blue light of half a dozen monitors. The air thick with the smell of stale espresso and the hum of overheating processors. Jungkook didn't even look up at first, his fingers flying across a keyboard with a rhythmic, desperate intensity, while Jimin sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, surrounded by mountains of legal folders and hand-drawn blueprints that looked like they belonged in a government heist rather than a pop star's getaway. Mrs. Jian's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening as she realized they weren't resting or celebrating a successful tour. They were dismantling their own world, piece by piece, document by document. For months, Jungkook had been a ghost, his laughter replaced by a haunting silence, and his bright eyes dimmed by a fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. Mrs. Jian had followed him here, fueled by a mother's intuition and a terrifying fear that her son was losing himself to the very fame he had fought so hard to achieve. As she stepped further into the room, her heels muffled by the plush rug, she saw the title on the document Jimin was highlighting in neon yellow: The Independent Idol Initiative. It wasn't a scandal in the traditional sense, but in the world of ironclad contracts and corporate giants, it was a declaration of war. They were secretly building a sanctuary for trainees who had been discarded by the system, using their own personal fortunes to create a legal and financial safety net that would essentially bankrupt their own agency's monopoly. Jungkook finally noticed her, his body jerking in a momentary spasm of guilt before his expression hardened into something she had never seen before: a cold, adult resolve. He didn't apologize, and he didn't hide the papers. Instead, he stood up, his joints popping from hours of being hunched over, and looked his mother in the eye with a gaze that held the weight of 1,000 untold stories. Jimin stood up too, his hand instinctively reaching out to steady Jungkook, a silent anchor in the storm of their shared rebellion. The psychological toll of their secret life was written in the dark circles under their eyes, and the nervous habit Jungkook had developed of rubbing his wrists where the pressure of expectation felt like invisible shackles. Mrs. Jian felt a wave of nausea hit her as she realized the danger they were in, the external threat of corporate retaliation looming over them like a guillotine. If the agency found out they were funding a rival, a legal revolution from within, their careers would be over in a heartbeat, buried under lawsuits and public character assassinations. Yet, as she looked at Jimin's protective stance and the way Jungkook held his head high, she saw a flicker of the boy she used to know, the one who fought for what was right, not just what was profitable. The conflict within her tore her apart. She wanted to drag him out of that room to safety, but she also saw that this was the only way he could breathe again. The hours that followed were a blur of whispered explanations and frantic revelations. Jimin spoke of the younger trainees who were starving themselves to meet impossible standards, and Jungkook showed her the hidden clauses in their own contracts that had essentially turned them into high-priced property. The hotel room, once a symbol of luxury, became a war room where the stakes were nothing less than their souls. Mrs. Jian sat on the edge of the unmade bed, listening to the dynamic pacing of their plan, her heart hammering against her ribs as she understood that her son wasn't just doing something with Jimin, he was saving himself and taking the rest of the industry with him. As the sun began to bleed orange and purple hues across the Seoul skyline, the tension in the room shifted from frantic panic to a somber, determined peace. The secret was out, but the burden was now shared. Mrs. Jian reached out and took Jungkook's hand, finding it cold but steady. She looked at Jimin, who offered a tired, small smile that carried the depth of a brother's loyalty. They had spent years being the face of a machine, but in the silence of Suite 701, they had finally become the architects of their own destiny. The final documents were scanned and encrypted, sent to a network of lawyers who had been waiting for the signal to move. There was no turning back now, and while the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty and the looming shadow of a corporate empire, the air in the room felt lighter. Mrs. Jian stood by the window, watching the city wake up, knowing that by noon, the world would be reeling from the news. She turned back to see Jungkook and Jimin slumped against the headboard of the bed, finally asleep, their hands still close to the laptops that held their future. The shock had faded, replaced by a fierce, maternal pride. The revolution had begun in a hotel room, and for the first time in years, her son was truly free. The dawn light that filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of the Lode Hotel was not the soft, golden glow of a new beginning, but rather a harsh, clinical white that exposed every stray wire and every exhausted line on their faces. Jungkook watched the progress bar on his screen, a thin, pulsing line of blue that represented the demolition of the life he had known for a decade. Beside him, Jimin's breathing had synchronized with the rhythm of the city waking up below them, a low, steady sound that was the only thing keeping Jungkook grounded as the final encryption key was hammered into the server. When the notification transmission complete finally flashed, the silence in the room became heavy, almost physical, pressing against his chest until he felt he might bruise. His mother remained by the window, a silhouette against the rising sun, her shadow stretching across the floor to touch the hem of his jeans, as if trying to pull him back from the edge of the cliff he had just jumped off. The drive back to the agency's headquarters felt like a funeral procession in high-speed motion, the sleek black sedan slicing through the morning fog of Seoul, while the world remained blissfully unaware that the foundations of the entertainment industry were about to crack. Jungkook kept his hands buried in the pockets of his oversized hoodie, his fingers tracing the sharp edge of a spare thumb drive his insurance, his weapon, his life. Jimin sat next to him, staring out at the Han River, his reflection in the glass looking like a ghost of the vibrant performer the world adored. They didn't speak. They didn't need to, for the shared trauma of the last 48 hours had forged a silent telepathy between them. They knew that by the time they reached the top floor of the glass and steel monolith that housed their careers, the legal firm they had hired would have served the injunctions, and the narrative they had carefully maintained for years would be shattered. As they stepped into the lobby, the air-conditioned chill felt like a slap. The staff, usually bowing with practiced precision, seemed to vibrate with a nervous energy, their eyes darting toward the two idols with a mixture of awe and terror. The news had broken minutes ago. A leaked manifesto, a series of financial discrepancies highlighted by anonymous whistleblowers, and the sudden, public resignation of 3 top-tier legal advisors. The elevators hummed as they ascended, the digital floor numbers ticking upward like a countdown to an explosion. When the doors opened to the executive floor, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and panic. CEO Park was standing behind his mahogany desk, his face a mask of controlled rage, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of a tablet displaying the morning's headlines. The confrontation was not a shout but a whisper, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Jungkook felt the psychological weight of years of conditioning the instinct to bow, to apologize, to be the golden child warring with the cold, hard reality of the injustice he had uncovered. He looked at the man who had groomed him for stardom and saw not a mentor, but a gatekeeper. Jimin stepped forward, his voice steady despite the visible tremor in his hands, laying out the terms of their rebellion. They weren't just leaving, they were taking the blueprint of the system with them. They spoke of the hidden cameras in the dorms, the manipulated weigh-ins of the younger trainees, and the systematic draining of artist funds into offshore accounts. Every word was a brick thrown through a glass house, and as the CEO's face shifted from rage to a desperate, calculating fear, Jungkook realized for the first time that the monsters he had feared were actually just men in expensive suits. The external pressure mounted within hours. The agency's PR machine attempted to spin the story as a mental health crisis, a temporary lapse in judgment caused by the exhaustion of the tour. But the evidence Jungkook and Jimin had compiled was too granular, too undeniable. Outside the building, the fans began to gather, not with lightsticks and cheers, but with signs demanding transparency. The sound of the crowd was a dull roar that penetrated the thick glass of the conference room where they were being held for negotiations. Jungkook's mother, who had managed to slip into the building under the guise of a concerned parent, sat in the corner, her presence a silent, fierce shield. She watched as her son navigated the shark-infested waters of corporate law, her heart aching at the loss of his innocence, but swelling at the sight of his integrity. The internal conflict within Jungkook was a jagged thing, a constant back and forth between the relief of honesty and the terror of the unknown. He found himself retreating to the stairwell during breaks, the cold concrete a relief against his feverish skin. Jimin would always find him there, offering a bottle of water or a silent hand on his shoulder. Their bond had shifted from professional camaraderie to something primal and essential. They were two survivors on a raft in a stormy sea, holding on to each other because the alternative was drowning. They shared moments of quiet reflection where the bravado faded, and they admitted to the fear of never being able to sing on a stage again. Would the world still want them if they weren't the perfect products they were sold as? Would the music still sound the same without the glitter and the lies? As the sun began to set on the third day of the standoff, the legal battle reached its first major climax. A whistleblower from the accounting department, emboldened by Jungkook and Jimin's stance, came forward with the Black Ledger, the definitive proof of the agency's corruption. The power dynamic shifted instantly. The threats of blacklisting and multi-million-dollar lawsuits evaporated, replaced by a desperate scramble for damage control. Jungkook sat in the center of the storm, watching the lawyers argue over clauses and NDAs, feeling a strange sense of detachment. He realized that the Independent Idol initiative was no longer just a dream scribbled on a hotel notepad. It was a reality that was breathing on its own. The final resolution came not with a celebratory party, but with a somber signing of documents that dismantled the agency's control over their lives. They walked out of the building into the cool night air, the flashes of 1,000 cameras illuminating the path like strobe lights. For the first time, Jungkook didn't hide his face or shield his eyes. He looked directly into the lenses, his expression one of tired, triumphant clarity. Jimin walked beside him, his head held high, the two of them a singular force that had changed the trajectory of an entire industry. They reached the car where Mrs. Jeon was waiting, her eyes wet with tears of relief. The aftermath was a whirlwind of restructuring and rebuilding. They moved into a small, unassuming office that smelled of fresh paint and possibility, a far cry from the opulent prisons of their past. The psychological scars remained. Jungkook still jumped at the sound of a ringing phone, and Jimin struggled with the sudden absence of a rigid schedule, but they were healing. They began the work of protecting the next generation, turning their hotel room rebellion into a lasting sanctuary. The memory of that night in the Lotte Hotel, the clicking of the keycard, and the look on his mother's face remained etched in Jungkook's mind as the moment he chose to be a man instead of a myth. As he sat at his new desk, looking out at a soul that looked different now, he knew the mystery of their future was the greatest gift they had ever been given. The transition from the polished, sterile corridors of the agency to the raw, echoing space of their new headquarters felt like waking up from a decade-long fever dream. The office was located in a converted warehouse in Seongsu-dong, a place where the air tasted of industrial history and fresh-roasted coffee, far removed from the manicured perfection of Gangnam. Jungkook stood in the center of the main room, his boots scuffing against the unfinished concrete floor, listening to the hollow ring of his own footsteps. There were no stylists here to fix his hair, no managers to schedule his breaths, and no security details to wall him off from the world. It was terrifyingly quiet. Jimin was in the corner, hunched over a folding plastic table that served as their temporary command center, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of two mismatched monitors. The scent of sawdust and floor wax hung heavy in the air, a sensory reminder that they were no longer products being polished, but builders getting their hands dirty. The silence was broken by the sharp, rhythmic rapping of heels against the concrete. Mrs. Jeon entered, carrying a box of files that looked heavy enough to crush her. Yet she moved with a renewed vigor that seemed to shave years off her age. She didn't look like the worried mother who had burst into Suite 701. She looked like a woman who had finally found a war worth fighting. She dropped the box onto the table with a thud that echoed through the high ceilings, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. Jungkook watched her, noticing the way she didn't wait for permission to start organizing. She was the anchor they hadn't known they needed, the one who saw the human beings behind the icons. She looked at Jungkook, her eyes scanning his face for signs of regret, but all she found was a jagged, raw determination that mirrored her own. The first few weeks were a relentless barrage of logistical nightmares and psychological warfare. The industry didn't just let them go, it tried to erase them. Distribution deals were mysteriously cancelled, and venues that had once begged for their presence suddenly found their calendars fully booked for the next 3 years. Jungkook felt the weight of the blacklisting like a physical pressure on his lungs. He spent hours on the phone, his voice growing hoarse as he argued with former associates who were too afraid of the agency's reach to even say his name. He felt the old habit of biting his lip until it bled returning, a physical manifestation of the anxiety that simmered just beneath the surface. He wasn't just fighting for a career anymore. He was fighting for the right to exist in a space he had helped build. Jimin, meanwhile, had become the guardian of the sanctuary. The first few trainees began to arrive under the cover of darkness, young boys and girls with hollow eyes and trembling hands, carrying their entire lives in plastic bags. Jimin sat with them for hours on the floor of the warehouse, listening to stories that were mirror images of his own past. He showed them how to read the fine print in their new transparent contracts, and he ensured that the kitchen was always stocked with actual food, not just the ice cubes and vitamins that had been their previous diet. He was the emotional architect of the project. His empathy, a double-edged sword that allowed him to heal others while bleeding himself dry. Jungkook would often find him asleep at the table, a highlighter still gripped in his hand, his face pale with a fatigue that no amount of sleep could touch. One rainy Tuesday, the external pressure reached a boiling point. A major news outlet, likely fed information by their former agency, published a deep dive into the financial origins of the Independent Idol initiative, alleging that Jungkook and Jimin had embezzled funds during their final tour to launch the project. The accusation was a tactical strike designed to turn the public against them, to paint their rebellion as simple greed. Jungkook felt a cold, paralyzing rage as he read the article, the words blurring before his eyes. It was a betrayal of the highest order, a calculated attempt to destroy the one thing they still had, their integrity. He wanted to lash out, to post a frantic defense on social media, but Jimin stopped him, his hand firm on Jungkook's arm. They couldn't play by the old rules anymore. They couldn't react. They had to respond. They spent the next 48 hours in a frantic race against the clock, working with their small legal team to prepare a counterstrike. Mrs. Jian acted as the gatekeeper, filtering the hundreds of media requests and keeping the predatory paparazzi away from the warehouse doors. The air in the office was thick with tension, the hum of the computers sounding like a swarm of angry hornets. Jungkook found himself in the makeshift vocal booth they had built in the back, not to record a hit song, but to record a statement. He realized that his voice was his only weapon. He didn't use a script. He spoke from the gut, detailing the exact moment he realized he was being sold as a commodity, and the exact amount of money he had legally and transparently invested from his own savings to ensure no other kid had to feel that way. The video went live at midnight. It wasn't the polished, high-budget production the world expected from a global superstar. It was raw, poorly lit, and utterly devastating. Jungkook's face filled the screen, every pore and every shadow visible, his voice steady but thick with emotion. He showed the receipts literally. He displayed the audited financial statements of the initiative, juxtaposed against the redacted, predatory contracts the agency had forced upon them. The impact was instantaneous. The hashtag number the truth of 701 began to trend globally. But this time, it wasn't fueled by fandom hysteria. It was fueled by a collective, societal realization of the cost of entertainment. The smear campaign crumbled under the weight of the transparency they provided. As the immediate threat receded, a new, more internal conflict began to emerge. Jungkook struggled with the loss of the golden identity. Without the stage, the costumes, and the constant roar of the crowd, he felt adrift. He would catch his reflection in the dark windows of the warehouse and not recognize the man staring back. He was a CEO, a revolutionary, a mentor, but was he still an artist? This existential dread manifested in long nights of restless pacing, his mind spinning with the what-ifs. Jimin noticed the withdrawal, the way Jungkook would stare at his old stage shoes in the corner of the room as if they belonged to a dead man. One night, Jimin dragged him to the center of the warehouse, where the moon was casting long, silver rectangles on the floor. He didn't say anything. He just turned on a small, portable speaker and played a simple acoustic track they had recorded years ago for fun. They danced. It wasn't the sharp, synchronized choreography of a stadium show. It was fluid, messy, and deeply personal. They moved through the shadows, their bodies remembering the rhythm even when their minds were tired. In that moment, the warehouse didn't feel like a cold office or a war room. It felt like a home. The movement grounded Jungkook, reminding him that the music lived in his bones, not in a contract. He realized that the golden maknae was a shell he had outgrown, and the man he was becoming was far more complex and interesting. Jimin's laughter, light and genuine, broke the last of the tension. A sound that felt more precious than any award they had ever won. By the end of the first year, the Independent Idol Initiative had successfully transitioned its first class of trainees into a new kind of career. One where they owned their masters, controlled their schedules, and had access to mental health support as a right, not a luxury. The warehouse was now a bustling hub of creativity, the walls covered in art, and the air filled with the sound of different genres clashing and blending. Mrs. Jian had taken over the administrative side, running the office with an iron fist and a mother's heart, ensuring that the business remained as healthy as the people within it. She and Jungkook had found a new way to be mother and son, one based on mutual respect and shared secrets. The mystery of their future remained, but it was no longer a source of fear. They knew the industry would continue to shift, and the ghosts of their past would occasionally resurface, but they had built something that could withstand the tremors. On the anniversary of that night at the Lotte Hotel, Jungkook and Jimin sat on the roof of the warehouse, looking out at the sprawling lights of Seoul. The city looked the same, but they were fundamentally changed. They weren't just survivors, they were architects. Jungkook looked at the keycard he still kept in his wallet, the one from Suite 701, and realized it hadn't just opened a hotel room door. It had opened the world. The silence between them was no longer heavy, but full of the unwritten notes of the songs they were finally free to sing. The smell of rain-dampened asphalt and expensive perfume mingled outside the warehouse in Seong-Sudong as the night of the first unofficial showcase arrived. Jungkook stood in the wings of the makeshift stage, his pulse a frantic staccato against his ribs. This was not the Olympic Stadium. There were no pyrotechnics, no hydraulic lifts, and no ocean of glowing light sticks stretching into the horizon. Instead, there were 300 folding chairs, a sound system they had calibrated themselves until their ears rang, and a heavy velvet curtain that smelled faintly of the antique shop where they'd found it. The air was thick with the electric hum of anticipation and the raw, unpolished energy of the 12 trainees who were currently huddled in a circle nearby, their hands joined in a silent prayer. Jungkook looked down at his own hands, noticing they were steady for the first time in months. He wasn't the one performing tonight, yet the weight of responsibility felt heavier than any solo stage he had ever endured. Beside him, Jimin was adjusting the microphone pack on a young girl's belt, his movements precise and soothing. Jimin's hair was tucked behind his ears, and he wore a simple black turtleneck that made him look more like a professor than a pop icon. He caught Jungkook's eye and offered a small, knowing smirk, the kind of look they used to share right before the beat dropped in front of millions. It was a look that said they were still in the trenches together, even if the battlefield had changed from a stage to a movement. Mrs. John was stationed at the front entrance, her presence a formidable barrier against any unwanted guests. She had spent the last week vetting the guest list with the scrutiny of a high-level intelligence officer. Most of the attendees were parents of the trainees, a few brave independent journalists, and a handful of industry veterans who had grown weary of the soul-crushing machinery of the major labels. She wore a sharp, tailored blazer and a look of uncompromising authority, but Jungkook saw the way her eyes softened every time she looked toward the backstage area. She was protecting more than just a business. She was guarding the sanctuary they had bled to build. The internal conflict Jungkook had been nursing the morning of his own identity as a performer seemed to crystallize in the dim light. He watched the trainees, seeing the same hunger and fear in their eyes that he had felt at 15. But there was something else there too. A sense of agency. They knew their contracts. They knew their rights. They knew that if they tripped on stage, there wouldn't be a corporate reprimand waiting for them, only a supportive hand. Jungkook realized that his legacy wouldn't be defined by how many records he sold, but by how many voices he helped liberate. The golden part of him wasn't gone. It was being refined into something more durable than fame.
Head, eyes cold and calculating, reminded everyone in the room that he had survived the harshest spotlights in the world. He knew their games because he had played them better than anyone. The standoff lasted only a minute, but it felt like an eternity. The music continued to play, a defiant, rhythmic pulse that served as the soundtrack to the confrontation. The lawyer eventually handed the folder to Mrs. Jeon, whispered something that looked like a threat, and turned to leave. He knew that to press the issue now, in a room full of parents and press, would be a PR suicide mission. Mrs. Jeon didn't even open the folder. She handed it to a waiting assistant and turned back to the stage, gesturing for the show to continue. The message was clear. They were no longer afraid of the shadows. The performance that followed was nothing short of a revelation. It lacked the perfection of a corporate-produced show, but it had a soul that was often missing from the charts. There were cracks in the vocals, a few missteps in the choreography, and a palpable sense of vulnerability that moved the audience to tears. When the final note faded, the silence in the warehouse was profound, followed by a roar of applause that shook the very foundation of the building. Jungkook found himself cheering the loudest, his voice breaking as he watched the kids he had mentored take their first real bow. In the aftermath, as the crowd began to filter out and the adrenaline started to recede, Jungkook and Jimin found themselves alone on the roof of the warehouse. The city of Seoul was a tapestry of lights below them, a sprawling beast that they had finally learned to tame. Jimin leaned against the railing, the wind ruffling his hair. He looked at Jungkook and asked if he missed it, the roar of the stadiums, the feeling of being the center of the universe. Jungkook thought about it for a long time, listening to the distant sound of a siren and the hum of the city. He thought about the hotel room in the lot, the fear in his mother's eyes, and the weight of the secrets they had carried. He realized that for years, he had been a star that belonged to everyone else, burning himself out to keep others warm. Now, he was a different kind of light. He looked at Jimin, his brother in every sense that mattered, and shook his head. He didn't miss being a god. He liked being a man. They spent the rest of the night talking about the future, about the songs they would write for themselves, and the lessons they would teach the next generation. The mystery of what came next was no longer a void of anxiety, but a canvas of possibility. Mrs. Jeon joined them eventually, bringing 3 steaming cups of tea, and the news that the legal folder had been nothing more than a desperate bluff, a last-ditch effort to rattle them that had failed spectacularly. She sat between them, a silent testament to the power of a mother's intuition and the strength of a family rebuilt on truth. As the first hints of dawn began to gray the sky, Jungkook felt a profound sense of peace. The warehouse was quiet now, the trainees asleep in the dormitory they had built upstairs, and the industry was likely already buzzing with the news of the successful showcase. He knew there would be more battles, more injunctions, and more attempts to pull them back into the machine. But as he looked at the 2 people beside him, he knew they were ready. They had turned a scandal into a sanctuary, and in the process, they had found the one thing fame could never provide, the freedom to be exactly who they were. The story that had begun with a shocking discovery in a hotel room had transformed into a legacy of resilience, and for the first time in his life, Jungkook was exactly where he was meant to be. Would you like me to describe the first studio album they produced together as independent artists? The wind on the rooftop of the Seongsudong warehouse tasted of salt and impending rain, whipping Jungkook's hair across his eyes as he stared at the red pulsing light of the main camera. Beneath his feet, the vibration of the bass surged through the concrete. A low-frequency roar that felt like the earth itself was protesting the silence they had endured for so long. This wasn't just a concert. It was a digital broadcast being beamed directly to millions of screens, bypassing every major network and every corporate firewall that had tried to bury them. Jungkook checked his in-ear monitors, hearing the frantic, rhythmic heartbeat of the countdown, while beside him, Jimin was a shadow in the moonlight, his body coiled like a spring, eyes fixed on the distant glowing towers of the city they had once called home. The psychological weight of this moment was a physical pressure in Jungkook's chest, a realization that there was no safety net, no pre-recorded backing tracks to hide behind, and no corporate PR team to spin a failure into a success. The external threat arrived exactly 3 minutes before the signal was set to go live, manifested in the sudden appearance of 3 black SUVs screeching to a halt at the warehouse gates 5 stories below. Jungkook saw them through the perimeter feed on a small monitor tucked near the drum kit, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The agency wasn't coming with lawyers this time. They were coming with a physical shutdown order, a desperate last-ditch attempt to claim the equipment as stolen intellectual property. He looked toward the rooftop access door, expecting it to burst open at any second, but instead, he saw his mother. Mrs. Jiyeon stood by the heavy steel door, her hand resting on the industrial bolt, her face a mask of iron-willed calm that chilled Jungkook to the bone. She wasn't afraid of the men in suits downstairs, because she had spent the last 72 hours turning their own legal precedents into a cage they couldn't escape. Through the intercom, her voice was a sharp, steady blade, informing the security team below that any attempt to breach the door would be met with an immediate, automated leak of the remaining encrypted files from the black ledger. Jimin moved toward Jungkook in the dim light, the scent of his sweat and the ozone from the overheating amplifiers filling the small space between them. He didn't say a word, but the way he gripped Jungkook's shoulder, fingers digging into the fabric of his leather jacket, was a silent anchor in the rising storm. The internal conflict that had plagued Jimin for weeks, the fear that they were destroying the very thing they loved in their pursuit of freedom, seemed to vanish in the cold air of the rooftop. He looked at the camera, then at the city, and finally at Jungkook, his eyes reflecting the silver moonlight with a fierce, predatory clarity. They weren't idols tonight. They were revolutionaries, and the music they were about to play was the manifesto of their survival. The countdown hit 0, and the silence of the rooftop was shattered by a wall of sound so visceral it felt like a physical blow. Jungkook stepped into the light, his voice tearing through the night air with a raw, unrefined power that he had never been allowed to use before. The song was a sprawling, cinematic odyssey that mirrored the sensory chaos of their journey, the metallic click of the hotel keycard, the hum of the warehouse servers, and the whispered secrets of the trainees they were protecting. The camera moved around them in a dizzying, immersive dance, capturing the sweat on their brows and the jagged, desperate intensity of their movements. Every note was a defiance, every lyric a jagged piece of the truth they had been forced to swallow for a decade. As the performance reached its crescendo, the rain finally broke, a torrential downpour that turned the rooftop into a shimmering, watery stage. The water soaked through Jungkook's clothes, making the microphone stand slick and cold, but it only added to the primal energy of the moment. He saw Jimin spinning through the rain, his movements fluid and ethereal, a ghost in the machine who refused to be deleted. The psychological depth of their bond was laid bare for the world to see, not as a marketed friendship, but as a shared trauma being transformed into a shared triumph. They sang to each other, and for the thousands of young voices currently huddled in dormitories across the country, watching this broadcast on smuggled phones and realizing for the first time that the walls of their prisons were made of glass. Mrs. Jiyeon watched from the shadows of the doorway, her eyes never leaving her son. She could hear the sirens in the distance, the sound of the agency's defeat as the police arrived not to shut down the concert, but to investigate the internal evidence she had finally released to the public prosecutor. The shock she had felt in the hotel room months ago had been replaced by a quiet, burning pride that she knew would sustain her through the legal battles still to come. She saw Jungkook hit a high note that strained his very soul, his face turned toward the sky, letting the rain wash away the last of the golden mask he had worn for so long. He was no longer a product. He was a person, standing on a roof in the rain, telling the world that he was finally, irrevocably free. The concert ended not with a bow, but with a sudden, deliberate cut to black. The silence that followed was even more powerful than the music, a deafening void that left the audience gasping for air. On the rooftop, the three of them stood in the pouring rain, Jungkook, Jimin, and Mrs. Jiyeon, the only sound the rhythmic dripping of water from the eaves and the distant hum of the city. The mystery of what would happen tomorrow remained, but for the first time it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a promise. Jungkook reached out and took his mother's hand, then Jimin's, the three of them forming a closed circuit of resilience that no agency, no contract, and no scandal could ever break. They had started in a hotel room with a secret, and they had ended on a rooftop with the truth. and as the lights of Seoul flickered below them, they knew the world would never be the same again. The steam rising from the 3 coffee mugs in the warehouse kitchen was the only thing moving in the heavy, post-performance silence of the following morning. Jungkook sat with his back to the window, the gray light of a Seoul dawn casting long, jagged shadows across the wooden table where the debris of their revolution lay scattered. Hard drives, legal briefs, and the now silent phones that had spent the night vibrating with the collective shock of the world. The adrenaline that had sustained him on the rooftop had evaporated, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made his muscles ache and his thoughts move like thick syrup. He watched Jimin, who was staring at a singular, unblinking green light on the server rack, his expression one of profound, hollowed-out relief. They had done it. They had pierced the veil, but the silence that followed felt less like peace and more like the breath held before a landslide. The sensory details of the morning were sharp and unforgiving. The smell of damp concrete and the faint, ozone-sweet scent of the rain-soaked equipment downstairs mingled with the bitter aroma of the dark roast Mrs. Jeon had prepared. She was currently standing by the window, her silhouette sharp against the morning mist, her fingers tapping a rhythmic, nervous cadence against the glass. She wasn't looking at the city anymore. She was looking at the reflection of her son in the pane. The shock that had defined their initial encounter in the hotel room had been refined into something much more dangerous, a strategic maternal clarity. She knew that the broadcast hadn't just freed them, it had painted a massive, glowing target on the warehouse. The agency was in ruins, their stock price a flatlining pulse on the financial news tickers, but a wounded animal was always the most unpredictable. Jungkook felt a strange, phantom limb sensation, a psychological pull toward the life he had just dismantled. For years, every minute of his day had been accounted for by someone else. Now, the vacuum of his own agency felt terrifying. He looked at his hands, the skin still stained with the faint residue of the stage makeup he hadn't fully washed off, and realized he didn't know what he was supposed to do at 9:00 a.m. There was no van waiting, no hair and makeup team, no choreographer demanding precision. There was only the low hum of the city and the weight of the dozen lives upstairs, the trainees who had gambled their futures on his rebellion. The internal conflict was a cold weight in his stomach. He had saved them from a cage, but he didn't yet have the blueprint for the sanctuary he had promised. The peace was shattered by the sharp, jarring ring of the warehouse's landline, a number only 5 people in the world knew. Mrs. Jeon reached it before the second ring could finish. Jungkook watched her face as she listened, the muscles in her jaw tightening until a small vein pulsed at her temple. She didn't speak for a long time, and when she finally did, her voice was a low, dangerous whisper. She hung up and turned to the two of them, her eyes reflecting a new kind of crisis. The agency wasn't suing them anymore. They were liquidating. They were selling off their debt to a private equity firm known for asset stripping, which meant the contracts of every trainee in the building, and the masters of every song Jungkook and Jimin had ever recorded, were about to be auctioned off to the highest bidder to cover the agency's legal fees. It was a scorched earth policy designed to ensure that even if Jungkook and Jimin were free, they would never own their history. The news acted like a lightning strike, jolting Jungkook out of his lethargy. The external threat shifted from a corporate battle to a race against time. If they couldn't buy back their own legacy within the next 48 hours, it would be carved up and sold to the very people they had just fought to escape. Jimin stood up, his exhaustion replaced by a cold, calculating focus. He began pulling up the financial projections they had made in Suite 701, his mind working through the numbers with a desperate speed. They had their personal fortunes, but the price of their entire catalog and the freedom of the trainees would require a capital injection they didn't have. They were millionaires in a billionaire's war. The warehouse transformed into a war room once again, but the atmosphere had changed. The trainees, sensing the tension, had come downstairs, their young faces a mix of fear and resolve. One of them, a 14-year-old boy named Min-ho who had been the first to seek refuge, stepped forward and offered a small, crumpled piece of paper, a list of independent artists and former staff members who had reached out after the broadcast, offering not just support, but resources. Jungkook looked at the list and felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in years, hope that wasn't manufactured. They weren't just two idols against an industry. They were the center of a growing web of people who had been bruised by the same machine. The hours that followed were a cinematic blur of high-stakes negotiations and digital fundraising. Jungkook found himself on video calls with tech moguls who had been fans of their music and were eager to disrupt the entertainment industry's status quo. He didn't use a script. He spoke from the raw, jagged place in his heart where his trauma lived, explaining that this wasn't an investment in a label, but an investment in human dignity. Jimin handled the legal side, working alongside their mother to find the loopholes in the liquidation process, their fingers flying across keyboards as they tried to outmaneuver the private equity sharks. By the second night, the physical and mental toll was undeniable. Jimin's eyes were bloodshot, and Jungkook's voice had dropped to a low, gravelly rasp. They were sitting on the floor of the recording studio, surrounded by the physical evidence of their history, old costumes, awards they no longer cared about, and the instruments that had been their only true friends. Jungkook realized that the golden period was finally over, and what was emerging from the ashes was something far more resilient. He looked at Jimin and saw a man who had finally stopped trying to be perfect and started being real. The bond between them, once a professional necessity, had become a survival instinct. The climax of the financial battle happened at 3:00 a.m., in a silent exchange of digital signatures that felt more significant than any stadium performance. With the backing of a decentralized group of investors and their own life savings, they had secured the sanctuary and bought back their masters. The agency's attempt to erase them had failed. As the confirmation email flashed on the screen, a collective sob of relief broke out among the trainees. Jungkook leaned his head against the cold brick wall, the sound of his own heart finally slowing down to a normal rhythm. He felt a hand on his shoulder, his mother's hand, and when he looked up, he saw her smiling through tears of exhaustion. She had found her son, and in the process, she had helped him build a fortress. As the sun rose on the third day, the world outside looked different. The news was no longer about a scandal or a rebellion, but about the birth of a new model for the arts. Jungkook walked to the large loading dock doors of the warehouse and pushed them open, letting the crisp, morning air of Seongsudong flood the space. He didn't see fans or paparazzi this time. He saw the local shopkeepers setting up their stalls, the delivery drivers starting their rounds, and the mundane, beautiful reality of a world that didn't care if he was a star. He stood there for a long time, the silence no longer heavy but full of the unwritten music of a life that belonged entirely to him. The journey that had started with a keycard click in a hotel room had reached a stable, quiet ground. There were still lawsuits to settle and a new industry to build, but the fear was gone. Jungkook looked back into the warehouse, where Jimin was showing a trainee how to use the mixing board and his mother was finally, peacefully, drinking a cup of tea that wasn't cold. He realized that the mystery of the future was no longer a threat to be feared, but a song to be written. He was the architect of his own soul, and for the first time, the music he heard in his head was perfectly, beautifully his own. The dust motes danced in the shafts of late afternoon sun that pierced the warehouse windows, but the air inside the newly minted studio was thick with the scent of soldering iron and the metallic tang of fresh wiring. Jungkook sat on the floor, his legs sprawled across a sea of tangled XLR cables, his attention entirely fixed on a vintage reel-to-reel tape machine they had salvaged from an old recording studio in the outskirts of the city. He wasn't looking at a script or a teleprompter. He was looking at Jimin, who was currently draped over a stool in the corner, his eyes closed as he hummed a melody that felt like it had been carved out of the very silence they had fought so hard to achieve. The click of the tape starting was a small, physical sound, but in the quiet of their sanctuary, it felt as monumental as the hotel keycard snap had months ago. This was the first day of recording for the project they had dubbed the Unmasking, and the psychological weight of it was visible in the way Jungkook's shoulders finally dropped their defensive hunch, replaced by a raw, creative tension that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Mrs. Jiyeon entered the room with the quiet authority of someone who had navigated 1,000 storms. She wasn't carrying a tray of tea this time. She was carrying a stack of revised articles of incorporation for their collective. As she watched her son and Jimin, she felt a lingering echo of that initial shock she'd experienced at the Lot Hotel, but it had transformed into a profound, almost painful admiration. She remembered the fear in Jungkook's eyes that night, the way he had looked like a trapped animal in the flickering blue light of those monitors. Now, as he adjusted the levels on the tape machine, she saw a man who had reclaimed his own narrative. She moved to the edge of the room, leaning against a brick pillar, her eyes tracing the way the two of them worked without speaking, a synchronized dance of intuition and shared history that no agency could ever replicate. She realized that what she had witnessed in that hotel room wasn't just a rebellion against a contract. It was the birth of a new kind of brotherhood, a bond forged in the fire of shared survival and the desperate need for truth. The external world remained a cacophony of opinions and legal threats, but inside the warehouse, the packing of their lives had shifted to the rhythmic pulse of the music. They spent 48 hours straight in that room, the internal conflict between their old, polished personas and their new, raw identities manifesting in the jagged edges of the songs they were writing. Jungkook found himself struggling with a vocal line, his voice cracking on a high note he used to hit with clinical perfection. In the old days, a producer would have smoothed that over with software, erasing the human element in favor of a commercial sheen. But Jimin stopped the recording, walked over to Jungkook, and simply leaned his forehead against his, their breaths mingling in the cool air of the studio. He told Jungkook to keep the crack, to let the world hear the sound of a man who was finally allowed to break. The vulnerability of that moment, the sensory detail of the cold floor against their feet, and the warmth of their shared resolve, became the heartbeat of the entire album. As the sessions progressed, the psychological depth of their journey began to bleed into every lyric and every chord. They weren't just writing songs, they were performing an exorcism. They wrote about the weight of the cameras, the hunger that wasn't just physical, and the crushing loneliness of being a god in a glass house. Mrs. Jiyeon often stayed late into the night, sitting in the shadows of the mezzanine and listening to the raw, unedited takes. She heard the stories they had been too afraid to tell her, the nights spent crying in dressing rooms, the pressure to be golden when they felt like lead, and the way they had found solace in their secret hotel meetings, planning a future that didn't involve being someone else's property. The shock she had felt was now a permanent part of her identity, a reminder that the son she thought she knew was only a fraction of the man who stood before her now. The climax of the creative process arrived when they decided to invite the trainees to participate in the final track of the album. The warehouse was suddenly filled with the voices of 12 young people who had been discarded by the system, their energy, a vibrant, chaotic contrast to the somber intensity of the recording sessions. Jungkook stood in the center of the room, his hand raised like a conductor, watching as these kids found their own voices for the first time. The smell of the warehouse changed, no longer just dust and ozone, but the electric scent of collective hope. Jimin was among them, his laughter ringing out as he taught them the harmonies, his face finally free of the mask he had worn for a decade. It was a sensory overload of sound and light, a cinematic moment that felt like the true resolution of the conflict they had started in Suite 701. When the final mix was finished, the silence that followed was the loudest thing they had ever heard. They stood together in the control room, Jungkook, Jimin, and Mrs. Jiyeon, the three of them a unified front against the world that was still waiting for them to fail. The mystery of their future was no longer a source of anxiety, it was the ultimate freedom. They had taken the shock, the scandal, and the secret, and they had turned it into a sanctuary. As the sun set over the Han River, casting a long, golden glow across the city. Jungkook looked at his mother and saw a woman who was no longer just his parent, but his partner in a revolution. He looked at Jimin and saw the architect of his soul. The music they had created was the final piece of the puzzle, a testament to the fact that the most shocking thing they had ever done wasn't hiding in a hotel room. It was daring to be themselves. The warehouse doors were thrown open one last time, not for a broadcast or a legal battle, but to let the air of a new world in. They walked out onto the street, the cool evening breeze a refreshing contrast to the heat of the studio, their footsteps echoing on the pavement with a steady, purposeful rhythm. They weren't running anymore. They were just living. The legacy of their rebellion was no longer a secret, but a lighthouse for everyone else who was still trapped in the dark. As the lights of Seoul flickered to life, Jungkook reached for his mother's hand on one side and Jimin's on the other, the three of them disappearing into the crowd, no longer icons, but human beings who had finally found their way home. The morning after the album dropped was unlike any other morning in Jungkook's life, primarily because for the first time in 15 years, there was no alarm clock set by a manager and no itinerary waiting on a laminated sheet. The warehouse felt cavernous and strange in the early light, the silence vibrating with the ghost notes of the music they had finally released into the world. Jungkook stood in the small kitchen area, the floor cold against his bare feet, watching the coffee drip into a glass carafe with a rhythmic, hypnotic sound. He felt a profound sense of hollowness, not of the empty kind, but the sort that comes after a long-held breath is finally released. The psychological weight of the secret they had carried since that night in the Lot Hotel, the blueprints, the legal threats, the clandestine meetings with Jimin, had been transformed into a public reality. There was no going back to the golden facade, and as he looked at his reflection in the darkened window, he saw a man whose face was lined with a history he was finally allowed to own. Jimin emerged from the recording booth area, his hair a chaotic nest and his eyes heavy with the kind of fatigue that only comes from a soul-deep exertion. He didn't say anything. He simply walked over and leaned his weight against the counter next to Jungkook, their shoulders brushing. The sensory familiarity of Jimin's presence was the only thing that made the shift in their reality feel grounded. They had spent years as a synchronized unit on stage, but this new partnership, this shared burden of leadership and revolution, was a different kind of dance entirely. Jimin reached for a mug, his fingers trembling slightly, a physical manifestation of the adrenaline crash. The internal conflict was still there, the quiet fear that they had led these trainees into a different kind of precariousness. But as Jimin took a sip of the bitter coffee, he offered a small, tired smile that signaled a shared, unspoken resolve. Mrs. Jian entered the room moments later, her presence instantly tightening the loose atmosphere into something more structured. She was dressed in a sharp, charcoal gray suit, her hair pulled back into a knot so tight it looked painful. She looked like a woman ready for a courtroom, but when her eyes landed on Jungkook, they softened into a look of such raw maternal relief that it made his throat ache. She had been the first person to find them in that hotel room, the first to witness the scandal that was actually a liberation, and she had become the silent architect of their defense. She sat at the table and opened a tablet, but before she checked the charts or the news, she reached out and squeezed Jungkook's hand. The shock of that night months ago had been a catalyst for her own transformation. She had gone from a worried mother to the guardian of a movement, and the pride she felt now was a fierce, protective shield. The external pressure reached a new peak that afternoon when they received an invitation that seemed more like a challenge. A major international cultural forum, held at a historic theater in central Seoul, wanted them to speak about the future of the entertainment industry. It wasn't a performance request, it was an intellectual one. The agency's remains were still trying to sue them for breach of contract, and the public was still divided between those who saw them as heroes and those who saw them as traitors to the system that made them. Jungkook felt a spike of visceral anxiety at the thought of standing before an audience without a song to hide behind. The stage had always been his armor, but this forum required him to be exposed. He looked at the invitation and then at the warehouse doors, feeling the old urge to hide, but Jimin caught his eye, a silent challenge in his gaze. They had unmasked themselves in the music. Now they had to do it in person. The day of the forum was overcast, the sky a bruised purple that matched the intensity of the atmosphere outside the theater. Thousands of people had gathered, not with the usual celebratory fervor of a concert, but with a quiet, intense curiosity. The smell of rain was heavy in the air, and the sound of the crowd was a low, rolling murmur that Jungkook could hear even through the thick walls of the backstage area. He was wearing a simple, well-tailored black suit. No glitter, no logos, no branding. He caught his reflection in a full-length mirror, and for the first time, he didn't see a character. He saw Jungkook. Beside him, Jimin was adjusting his own cuffs, his movements deliberate and calm. The bond between them had reached a point of absolute transparency. They were no longer worried about how they were perceived by each other, only how they could best represent the kids waiting back at the warehouse. As they walked onto the stage of the theater, the silence that greeted them was more deafening than any cheer. There was no backing track, no lights flashing in time with a beat. There was only a podium and 3 chairs. Mrs. Jeon sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on her son with a steady, unwavering light. Jungkook took a breath, the air in the theater tasting of old wood and anticipation, and he began to speak. He didn't use the polished, polite tone he had been trained to use for years. He spoke about the hotel room. He spoke about the moment his mother walked in and saw the monitors and the blueprints. He spoke about the fear of losing everything and the greater fear of never finding himself. The psychological depth of his words moved the room in a way a song never could. He was showing them the scars of the machine. Jimin followed, his voice a melodic but firm counterpoint to Jungkook's raw honesty. He talked about the psychological toll of perfection and the importance of the sanctuary they had built. He spoke about the trainees and the responsibility they felt to ensure that the next generation didn't have to hide in hotel rooms to dream of a better future. The audience sat in a state of collective immersion, the sensory detail of the moment, the creak of the floorboards, the catch in Jimin's voice, the intensity of the gaze between the 2 men, creating a cinematic tension that felt like the climax of a long, arduous film. They weren't just defending themselves, they were dismantling a culture of silence. The forum ended not with a standing ovation, but with a profound, thoughtful silence that lasted for several seconds before the applause began. It wasn't the frenzied screaming of fans. It was the respectful, sustained clap of a community that had been awakened. As they walked off the stage, Jungkook felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion. He found his mother in the wings, and without a word he pulled her into a hug. The shock of the Lot Hotel had finally been laid to rest, replaced by a resolution that was both painful and beautiful. He looked at Jimin, who was leaning against the wall, watching them with a look of quiet triumph. The mystery of their future was no longer a shadow over their heads. It was a path they were carving with every step they took. Back at the warehouse that night, the 3 of them sat on the roof, watching the lights of Seoul flicker like a fallen galaxy. The trainees were downstairs, the sound of their laughter and the faint hum of a new melody drifting up through the vents. Jungkook leaned back against the brickwork, the cool night air a balm on his skin. He realized that the doing something his mother had caught them doing in the hotel wasn't just a business plan or a rebellion. It was an act of profound, radical love for their craft and for each other. They had risked their lives to save their souls, and as the sun began to hint at another dawn, Jungkook knew that the music they would make from now on would be the loudest thing the world had ever heard. The story that had started in a hotel room with a secret had ended in a warehouse with a home, and for the first time in his life, the silence was perfect. The heavy industrial doors of the Seongsudong warehouse groaned on their rollers, swinging open to admit a gust of wind that carried the scent of rain and the distant, rhythmic thrum of the city. Jungkook stood on the mezzanine, his hands gripping the cold iron railing as he watched the first wave of international artists filter into the space. They were a kaleidoscope of styles and languages, guitarists from London with scuffed cases, producers from Berlin with eyes bright with digital ambition, and vocalists from Sao Paulo whose voices carried the warmth of 1,000 suns. This was the Nexus Project, the global manifestation of the rebellion that had begun in the flickering blue light of a hotel room. Jungkook felt a strange, electric shiver crawl up his spine, a mixture of pride and a lingering, phantom anxiety. The psychological weight of leadership was a different kind of burden than the weight of fame. Here, he wasn't just responsible for a performance, but for the safety of a dream. Jimin was already on the floor, weaving through the crowd with a natural, grounded grace. He wasn't the untouchable icon today. He was the primary architect of the movement's heartbeat. He wore a simple, oversized white shirt that caught the afternoon light, and as he spoke to a young producer from Tokyo, his gestures were fluid and inclusive. Jungkook watched the way Jimin's presence seemed to de-escalate the room's nervous energy, turning a gathering of strangers into a community of survivors. The bond between them had evolved into something tectonic, slow, powerful, and fundamental. They had spent years being the face of a machine, but in this warehouse, surrounded by the smell of fresh coffee and the hum of amplifiers, they were finally the blood in the veins of a new world. Mrs. Jeon sat in the glass-walled office that overlooked the main floor, her desk a landscape of legal documents and global distribution maps. She watched the scene below through the glass, her reflection ghosting over the image of her son. The shock she had felt that night at the Lot Hotel, the sight of the monitors, the blueprints, and the desperate intensity in Jungkook's eyes, remained the defining moment of her life. It had been the fracture that allowed the truth to leak through. She had gone from a mother fearing a scandal to the general of a creative army. She noticed a group of men in dark suits lingering near the perimeter of the warehouse, detectives or perhaps corporate spies, but she didn't flinch. She had spent the last several months building a legal fortress around this building that was as impenetrable as her own resolve. She adjusted her glasses, her fingers steady, and returned to a contract that would officially sever the last remaining ties between the trainees and their former lives. The internal conflict within Jungkook reached a fever pitch as the first session began. He found himself sitting at the vintage tape machine, the same one they had used for the black box sessions, but his mind kept drifting back to the hotel. He remembered the feeling of the keycard in his hand, the way the plastic had felt cheap and fragile, much like the life he was leading then. He wondered if he was truly free or if he had simply built a bigger, more comfortable cage. This doubt was a jagged, cold thing in his chest. Jimin noticed the withdrawal, the way Jungkook's eyes clouded over as the music began to swell around them. Without a word, Jimin walked over and sat on the floor beside the tape machine, his shoulder leaning against Jungkook's knee. It was a sensory anchor, a physical reminder that they were in this together. Jimin didn't offer platitudes. He simply stayed there, a silent witness to the war still raging inside his friend's mind. The climax of the week-long workshop arrived during an improvisational session that lasted until the early hours of a Tuesday morning. The warehouse was a symphony of clashing cultures and sounds, a traditional Korean gaegeum blending with industrial techno beats, and operatic vocals soaring over jazz-infused bass lines. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of overheating processors. Jungkook found himself drawn to the center of the room, picked up a microphone, and began to sing. He didn't use words at first, just sounds that echoed the cinematic tension of his journey. It was a raw, immersive experience for everyone in the room. He was showing them the scars of his transformation through the vibration of his vocal cords. As the music reached a crescendo, the external threat they had been expecting finally manifested. The warehouse lights flickered and died, plunged into a sudden, suffocating darkness. For a moment, the only sound was the heavy breathing of 50 people and the distant rain against the roof. Then, the emergency lights kicked in, casting a sickly red glow over the space. A group of officials from the city's zoning board, accompanied by the agency's top-tier legal team, pushed through the front doors. They were there to serve a final closure order, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to label the sanctuary a safety hazard and shut it down before the movement could spread further. The confrontation was cinematic in its intensity. The lawyers stood in the center of the warehouse, their expensive shoes looking out of place on the concrete floor, surrounded by artists from every corner of the globe. Mrs. Jian descended from her office, her heels clicking a rhythmic, defiant cadence against the stairs. She didn't shout. She simply handed the lead official a single, encrypted tablet. It contained the real-time signatures of 100,000 independent artists and fans who had pledged to occupy the warehouse if a closure was attempted. It was a digital and physical shield, a demonstration of power that the old system couldn't comprehend. Jungkook stood behind his mother, Jimin at his side, the three of them a unified wall of resistance. The officials looked around at the defiant faces of the artists, the red light making everyone look like soldiers in a revolution, and they realized the battle was already lost. The resolution was quiet but profound. The officials retreated into the night, their SUVs disappearing into the soul fog. The warehouse erupted into a spontaneous, joyous roar, but Jungkook remained still, looking at the door. He felt the final shard of the golden mask fall away, leaving him exposed but entirely whole. The mystery of the future wasn't a threat anymore. It was an invitation. He realized that the shock his mother had felt wasn't a tragedy, but a birth. They had taken a secret in a hotel room and turned it into a lighthouse for the world. As the sun began to rise, painting the Han River in shades of bruised gold and soft pink, the three of them stood on the loading dock, watching the city wake up. The artists were asleep on various couches and sleeping bags inside, the warehouse humming with the quiet energy of a successful mission. Jungkook reached into his pocket and pulled out the keycard from Suite 701. He looked at it for a long time, the plastic worn smooth by his thumb, and then he dropped it into the drain below. It was a small, physical act of closure. He took his mother's hand and Jimin, the three of them standing as the architects of a new reality. The music of their lives was finally their own, and for the first time, the silence was enough.